Hello and welcome to the Outlaws podcast with Kate and Shayla for professionals unlearning the rules of work and life. Ditch the shoulds and build what fits. Today on Outlaws, we're speaking with someone who has been part of reshaping the national conversation about wellbeing in the legal profession. Dr Carly Schrever is a psychologist and a former lawyer whose work sits at the crossroads of empirical research, clinical insight, and the lived experience of practicing law.
Carly was Australia's first dedicated judicial wellbeing officer and one of the architects of the groundbreaking National Judicial Stress and Wellbeing Study. Her research supports the pressing need for cultural change across the profession. She's become a leading voice on occupational wellbeing, intentional hope, and the structural conditions that allow lawyers and judicial officers not only to survive in their work, but to thrive within it. In this episode, we talk about the realities behind the wellbeing statistics, the shoulds the profession still clings to, and what it truly means to build a sustainable legal career. Carly brings a scholar's rigour, a practitioner's clarity, and a rare blend of compassion and candour to this important issue.
Carly, welcome to the Outlaws podcast. It's so nice to have you on. Carly, you haven't met me before, and for those of you who are watching, I have just been to the dentist, so this is why I have one side of my mouth working and one side not working particularly well. So for those who don't watch on YouTube, now might be the time to turn in and have a laugh. Carly, tell us about yourself. We know that you're a lawyer and a psychologist. You did law first and then psych. What led you to do law?
Yeah, well, I was one of those people who just did better in year 12 than I ever expected to, and then thought, even though I didn't get this from my parents, this had not been strong messaging, but somehow I thought that if you could do law or medicine, you should do one or the other. And I felt that I was more humanities than science, so I should do law. But it kind of appealed. I didn't know anything about it. There were no lawyers in the family at all. But the notion appealed to me, the idea of contributing to a system that's designed to achieve fair outcomes for people, that is designed to ensure the vulnerable are protected, that's designed to keep power in check. Even as a teenager, those ideas appealed to me. So I think that was really the motivation at the time.
Yeah. And then so you did law. Did you practice?
Yeah, I did. I did science law, combined degree, and then did my articles at Allens Arthur Robinson, as it then was, now Allens, in intellectual property. So I was there for a year and kind of worked out pretty early on, even though there was so many things to love about Allens as a firm, and I've met some of my best friends and indeed my current partner through my articles cohort at Allens. I worked out early on that big commercial practice was not going to be my natural home. And so I lined up a judge's associateship at the end of my articles and did 2 years at the Supreme Court of Victoria with Justice David Habsburger. And my plan at that point was to go to the bar. But it was actually while I was in my second year with the judge. I loved my time at the court. It was while I was in my second year with him that I had my epiphany that as much as I loved the courtroom environment and the justice sector and the legal profession, I was so much more interested in the human dynamics than I was in the legal argument. And I really came to see that I wasn't enthusiastic about any of the options I could see for myself in legal practice. So that's when I decided to return to university and do postgraduate study in psychology.
Okay.
Wow.
So you had the science undergrad.
Yes, but no psychology in the science undergrad.
Right.
Yeah.
So what did that look like? It's 4 years, isn't it, psychology, and then a master's after that?
Yeah, well, it's 6 years minimum. 6 years
Wow.
minimum full-time to get qualified. So, and I was not wanting to go back to uni full-time at that point. So I was looking for a job for a lawyer that was not legal practice because I wanted a job that didn't have outrageous hours so I could study on the side.
Yep.
And I approached the Judicial College of Victoria, which in Victoria is the statutory authority responsible for the ongoing professional development of the judiciary. So I approached them for a job in judicial education, which I got, and then I undertook my postgraduate studies, but it was really the undergraduate part of psychology first,
Right.
which then I had to do honours and then a master's, and then ultimately I did a PhD as well. But the whole time I was working at the Judicial College,
Right.
with the judiciary and the legal profession.
We don't have a judicial college in WA. Note to the Attorney General if he's listening. But
Yeah. There is a national college as well. There are a few bodies that work nationally, but New South Wales and Victoria are the only states that have state dedicated bodies.
And so you became a psychologist. So that's a long play,
Yeah, it
as we
is.
say. And so,
Well, I did my the undergraduate portion of that over
yep,
4 years part-time, then
yep,
my honours full-time, and then my master's full-time. Yeah, so really, and then I
yeah,
converted it to a master's PhD. So I don't even know how many years that is. It's probably
yeah,
10
A
years a
lot.
lot. Yeah.
It's a lot.
yeah.
And so what age were you?
I was 27 when I started.
Yeah.
And I mean, my PhD, because I also did that part-time, I only finished it a couple of years ago.
But
It was
again,
probably more than 10, actually.
but as we
Yeah.
like to say, a lot of people think, oh, I can't possibly do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to be blah by the time I finish. It's like, yeah, well, you're going to be that age anyway. So
Exactly. That was actually what dawned on me is I thought, oh my goodness, I've spent 9 years on this track to being a lawyer. Can I really step off and spend at least 6 on another track? And then I thought, well, those 6 years are going to pass and I'll either be a mediocre, maybe miserable lawyer, or I'll be a psychologist, which is what I want to be. And that's in
Yeah.
the end why I made the decision.
And
Well
so what
done.
happened after you finished? Have you been working as a psych? What we're obviously going to
Yeah.
get to, and why we're so keen to talk to you is that unique combination of psychologist and lawyer has led you to your involvement in this big examination of judicial wellbeing. But but just staying on you for a second, did you practice when you completed your studies? Was that a springboard to practicing as a psych, or?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I was at some point along the journey, my role at the Judicial College shifted from being just a general judicial education manager to being the judicial wellbeing advisor.
Okay, right.
So it wasn't strictly psychological practice in the sense that I wasn't seeing judges as clients, but I was working very specifically as a psychologically trained person for the benefit of the judiciary in
Yep.
Victoria.
Yep.
And this was happening alongside doing my PhD. Because the Masters and the PhD were being done together, I had to have completed a certain portion of my PhD before I became fully qualified as a psychologist and could actually practice anyway. And that was in the end so close to finishing the PhD that it was only when I finished the PhD that I really started taking on private clients.
Yeah.
But of course, the training involves working with a whole lot of different parts of the
Yes.
system and having clients that way. Yeah.
So do you think it was just that you were working at the Judicial College that you became interested in this, or because that's really the direction then that your career's taken, hasn't it?
Totally. So when I approached the Judicial College for a job back when I was 27, I wasn't remotely thinking it was going to pave the way for what has become my vocation and my calling and my work in the world. I was really just, as I said, looking for a legal job that wasn't going to keep me there till midnight. But through working at the Judicial College, I came to know judicial officers at all levels of the system. I came to really care about them. I came to really have a lot of respect for what a tough job it is, and also really interested in the human dimension of the work. And it was just after I completed my honours and had started my master's that I had a conversation with the then Chief Judge of the County Court of Victoria, Michael Rosines, who said, we've had about 5 or 6 years now of good research on lawyer stress, on the stress within the legal profession. We don't have any data on the stress that judges and magistrates experience. He was saying that he was noticing that his judges were retiring as soon as they became eligible for retirement, not when they reached their statutory retirement age. And he was intuiting that that was something to do with burnout or perhaps secondary trauma, but he had no real way of knowing other than perhaps some of the anecdotal conversations he might have with people. And so he really said we need some empirical research here. And at that point, I just started my master's. I knew that I had to do a master's thesis. And I thought, well, maybe I can do this investigation for my master's thesis. And he said, well, if you do, I will 100% support you. We need to have this happen. And as I started to look into it, it became clear it was too big for a master's thesis. So I converted it to a PhD. So yeah, definitely it was the work at the Judicial College that led to this niche area in judicial wellbeing.
A serendipitous conversation.
Yeah. What I am so interested, I guess, Carly, in the work that you're doing is that I think as lawyers, we understand that becoming a judicial officer of any description feels like the peak. There's sort of, you become a partner in a big firm or you become a judicial officer. That is something that is, in inverted commas, considered as success in our profession. And I think probably translates to a lot of different professions as well, is that, that's kind of the top of the ladder once you get to there.
Yes.
And so, and recently, I don't actually think we've talked about it on the podcast, Kate, but recently I did a post on LinkedIn which reflected some of the studies from the UK around lawyer wellbeing and how I think it's 30% of lawyers want to leave the law, 60% suffer from anxiety and mental health problems. Like it's pretty damning. It's pretty awful. And from what I understand from the research on judicial wellbeing, it's the same. And I guess I just really was interested in your reflections of once people have climbed this ladder and got to this very top rung of the ladder, they don't appear to be super happy. And I'm just really interested in your reflections on the sort of conversations that you've had and what you've learnt out of some of those conversations.
I think it is a bit different with the judiciary than the general picture we get about the practicing profession. Certainly when we measure stress within the judiciary using validated instruments that many of which have been used in the lawyer wellbeing research, we get an overall picture of pretty high levels of psychological distress within the judiciary, certainly high levels of burnout and secondary trauma, but really low levels of mental ill health. So there's quite a different profile among the judiciary compared to the legal profession. And of course, within the legal profession, it's probably a much more diverse group in terms of age and all of that. But one thing that came out really, really strongly, and this is a very robust finding, not only in my research, but in the research that's followed, is that while there is a significant issue of stress among the judiciary, judicial officers also report really deep and abiding feelings of job satisfaction and commitment and dedication to the role. So what you were saying about the report coming out of the UK with 30% of lawyers wanting to leave the profession, there's no sense that that is paralleled among the judiciary at all. There's no real data on kind of intention to leave or anything like that. But it's just an acknowledgement that while, yes, as you said, being appointed as a judicial officer is a hallmark of success in a legal career, there is a significant psychological toll that the work does take over time, but that sits alongside just enormous professional and personal pride and satisfaction that judges get from the work as well. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, you've been involved in this work looking at judicial stress for quite a period of time now. Has there been any major surprises for you in your findings?
Yeah, well, I was certainly surprised by the level of secondary traumatic stress that we found among the judiciary. In my PhD research, I used a validated measure of secondary traumatic stress that hadn't been used with any lawyers and hadn't really been used in Australia, but had been used with other occupational groups in other parts of the world. And on that scale, 30% of judicial officers scored in the range that the authors of the measure suggested indicated likely PTSD.
Wow.
Now, I was staggered by that and I thought, this can't be right. But a couple of years later, a team of researchers from the University of New South Wales did a completely independent study with the New South Wales courts, and they employed a different validated measure of traumatic stress. There's a number of them out there. He remarkably found the exact same statistic, 30% of judges on that measure scoring in the range suggestive of PTSD. Now I've teamed up with those researchers and several other researchers from other states as well as part of a big national project on judicial stress and wellbeing. And we've got the data nationally, and that statistic holds nationally. So it's a really, really robust finding that the prevalence of secondary trauma symptoms among judicial officers is so high, indicating that that secondary trauma really is an occupational hazard of judicial work. And this sits alongside a population prevalence of PTSD in Australia, which is only about 5%. So it shows how elevated it is among the judiciary. So I was very surprised by that. But there was another surprise as well, because I actually went into the research expecting that judicial officers, when invited to speak about where they perceived the stress to come from, I expected them to really emphasise the distressing case content and working with distressed individuals. Certainly at the time that I embarked upon the research, that was really the only topic that was being spoken about, was the impact of case content. But in fact, within the confidential environment of the interviews, judges didn't tend to emphasise that. They talked about it, but they saw it as a burden that they had willingly taken on. What they emphasised were, firstly, workload, but then beyond that, they emphasised what I called stressors of injustice, which has kind of got two prongs to it. One was the real grief and distress that judges and magistrates reported when they feel that they were presiding over an imperfect justice experience in the courtroom. Due to a range of systemic factors that would be on their control, either inflexibilities in sentencing law or inadequacy of supports in the community to rehabilitate offenders, or just being forced to work so quickly that they didn't feel they could really ensure that the people coming before them had even really comprehended what was happening to them.
Right.
So that was one side of it. And then there was the other side, which was when the demands of the role were accompanied by personal feelings of unfairness within the working environment as a judge. So, for example, how the Court of Appeal might write about their decisions when overturning them, treatment by the media, transparency of leadership decisions, or even the perceived equity of work ethic and work allocation among judicial colleagues.
Right.
So they were the things that judicial officers spoke about, not case
So
content.
interesting.
Did you notice the difference between different levels of courts with those findings?
Yes. Yeah. So this was actually one of the most significant findings coming out of the research as well, that when we measured different forms of stress across the system. And in my PhD research, there were 5 courts involved from summary all the way to appellate level. And then we looked, so we got the general picture, and then we looked at, which judges are most stressed and why. The only demographic factor that I found that was significantly associated with stress levels was jurisdiction. So that is which court within the court hierarchy a judicial officer sits. There was no effect of age, gender, seniority, even area of practice. And what I found was that it was the judicial officers in the high volume lower courts, the magistrates' courts, were significantly more stressed on a range of measures than those in the trial and appellate courts. And that's another finding that's now been replicated in New South Wales and nationally in Australia as well.
I work with lawyers. I do coaching and management coaching with lawyers. And I was chatting to someone the other day and just talking about burnout, and they've got a team, and they were expressing that the team seemed really burnt out, and they're this team very much at the coalface of the sort of jurisdictions that you're talking about, the magistrates' court. And I was chatting to her and I said, I've got a new term. I don't know if someone's already discovered this. I'm sure that they've had, but I feel like what the lawyers are experiencing is like a system trauma. It's just that trauma of I'm going into a system every single day, which we know is incredibly broken, which we know delivers unjust outcomes. Yeah. This idea that it's a justice system, it's clearly not. We call it the legal system now because it is in fact so unjust, and that's incredibly tiring. So that's really interesting for me to hear that, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I've not heard of any research that's gone specifically to that point in lawyers.
Well, actually, there is some research coming out of New Zealand. It's not yet published, that has specifically looked at that. So a term in psychology, one of several terms to describe what you're talking about, is moral distress.
Yeah.
Or moral injury at its highest, where people feel that they are required to work in ways that are not aligned with their values, or that perhaps contribute to harm rather than prevent it. And I think there's a lot of qualitative data along those lines from lawyers and judges. Also, that sense, that kind of disconnection from meaning and purpose and the human value of our work is itself a symptom of burnout and secondary trauma. So it can become a bit of a snowball.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm not saying it's in people's minds. People are very much pushing up against system failures and limitations that are very real and that are very hard to bear witness to every day. And that contributes to burnout and secondary trauma, which can kind of intensify our focus on the brokenness and make it difficult for us to see all the good things that are also being done amidst the system failures. And that's actually something that I'm really, really interested in now, because in the work that I do with courts, but also other parts of the profession, once you kind of follow the wellbeing thread, you always get to that. You always get to that experience. And so I'm thinking, this has been a new piece for me, but I'm really thinking about what we do. What do we do as human beings in imperfect systems to be able to maintain hope and to continue to show up. And that's quite that's something I'm very interested in, and I'm finding it quite a generative topic of reflection for lawyers and judges too.
Do you have any ideas yet?
Well, it turns out that there's quite a field of scholarship on this intentional hope as a professional practice that comes out of other sectors. So people working in justice climate action, there's a whole piece around hope there. People working in international aid and development and kind of crisis response. So what's interesting about it is it's only when we come face to face with despair that hope even becomes a relevant and thing to focus on. And hope kind of doesn't even have a place in just middle class comfort. It's when our work brings us into contact with the brokenness of the world that we kind of called on or, need to bring hope into the equation. And we can do that without, and it's kind of understanding what hope is, that it's not wishful thinking. It's not optimism, naive optimism. It's not turning a blind eye to what is broken, but it's a refusal to accept that the way things are is the way they will always be. And it's also a real commitment to small acts of justice and dignity and kindness actually still mattering in the work that we do.
Yeah.
And I've found that personally very restorative, hope-giving, and I've found that it's been a really great conversation for lawyers and judges to have as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get off topic here, but I'd love to talk to you more about that, Carly, because I think certainly when I was CEO of the Mental Health Law Centre, so you're in a very, very broken system. I hadn't heard that term used in that way before, but I think for sure that's moral injury is probably what's going on for most lawyers that are working in that space. And I always just used to try and say to staff to focus on what it is that you've delivered for each client, like what great outcome have you delivered for that client, even in a very broken system, what difference have we made? And I think that there's a much bigger systemic piece that we can think about in terms of how we fund these kind of services and how we're measuring what we're doing. I think that sometimes the funding model also just really makes that whole situation worse because we're not focusing on the difference that we're making for clients. We're just kind of counting them or, so anyway, another conversation for another day.
Yeah, let's do that podcast next.
I don't know that our listenership is particularly interested in that topic, but I'm very interested in that topic.
No, for sure. I was just thinking too, as you've talked about, there's differences between the judicial officers and those different levels of court. Your work has been influential globally now. Are there any sort of universal principles you see across all of the different legal systems and cultures?
Look, it's a great question. And as I've increasingly come to work with judiciaries and courts in different parts of the world, I've been staggered at the universality of the judicial wellbeing experience globally, notwithstanding great variation in social political context. So when I've presented my research findings sometimes it's been to countries that are quite similar, like Canada, US, but sometimes in really different countries like Mongolia. It's amazing how when I present them saying, look, this is what the Australian judges said, but how does that resonate with you? Really always. It's like, yes, this is exactly how it is. Right. So the high and increasing to the point of becoming oppressive workload pressure that judicial officers are under is a global phenomenon. The ongoing stigmatisation of stress in legal and judicial culture, there's kind of matters of degree in different parts of the world that seem to map onto kind of how mainstream stress and wellbeing and mental health conversations are in society. But nonetheless, that seems to be universal. The isolation of the role and the greater impact of organisational and systemic stressors that really originate from the tasks of judging itself. That's something that's spoken about everywhere. And this was really important when just a little over a year ago now, I worked with an international committee of judges to draft the Nauru Declaration on Judicial Wellbeing, which is the first international statement of principles to guide judicial wellbeing reform and discussion globally. And we were, there were judges, there was judges from war-torn areas like the Ukraine on that committee from every continent. And we came together to think, what are the principles? And I'm not going to list them. There are 7 of them and people can Google them. But what came out strongly was the importance of seeing judicial wellbeing as essential to other institutional priorities like judicial integrity, access to justice, judicial education, the rule of law, judicial independence, and needing to have commensurate investment and resourcing alongside projects that support those principles. Really needing to tackle the idea of judicial stress as being a weakness because it compounds just natural, difficult challenges that judges can have over the course of their career with a sense of isolation and shame. So needing to tackle that, needing to see the responsibility is shared between the individual judge and the institution. And that's been really important because initially both the lawyer and judicial wellbeing conversation was all about upskilling individuals to be more resilient, but not addressing the systemic sources of stress. So then there are other principles as well. So I think it's very global and that's really encouraging, I think.
One of the things I'm interested to ask you about is I think that historically there's been, judges and judicial officers are sort of, up there. I mean, literally, usually.
Yes.
And, their objective, there's sort of a dehumanization in some ways. I've not been a judicial officer. I've been a quasi-judicial officer and as an arbitrator in a government sort of role. And I've never felt so disempowered in my entire life, and you could not pay me enough money to do a judicial role because I just hated that with a passion. And I just wonder, and I felt very dehumanized, not in the sense that anyone was making me feel like that, but the role means that you have to be, that often, all of the emotions taken out of it, you can't be a human. There was a really great judgment that went around a few months ago, which was a judgment that came out of the Family Court, I think, of New Zealand, which was a judgment that was written. It was an interlocutory application, an interim application in relation to child contact. And the judgment went around because it was written in a way that it was written like a letter to the child.
Wow.
So I've never read anything like it in my entire life.
Wow.
It was incredible. You read it and you felt as though the judge was a human, that the judge was really able to connect with the child. Whereas when you read normal judgments, it's just, it can come across quite cold, which again, like that's historical and there's reasons for that. But I wonder, and I think that this applies across law and probably across lots of other professions as well, where we're expected to take the human out of the equation. And I'm really interested as to whether or not you feel like that takes a toll on people.
I think it definitely does. And I think that historical reality has been one of the motivating principles for me in moving into judicial and lawyer wellbeing work, because we want this system to be human. We actually live in an age where very real questions are being asked about what judicial and legal functions can be divested to artificial intelligence. And I don't think any of us want an, impersonal algorithmic system deciding these questions of right and wrong and justice in our society. So we want this system to be human. We know that it's human beings inhabiting these roles. Perhaps go back a few decades and people actually did believe that judges are superhuman, but we know that's not the case. We know that no judge is above emotion and stress and vulnerability and all the sorts of experiences that the rest of us experience. And so how do we keep this system human, enable judges to do their work well in the way that society needs them to, but also not be harmed in the process? That, for me, is the motivation for this work. And I think we've made great strides in that, actually. I think that the lawyer and judicial wellbeing work has really underpinned that. It's totally put to bed for anyone who reads it, any notion that judges are somehow above these experiences. So we can just let that one go.
Yeah. And
then we can start having conversations about, okay, given that this is the reality, given that we are human and we will have emotional responses, how do we work with them? How do we, as collectively and individually, how do we inhabit this role as a human, but not also with role clarity? You can be humane and human in the judicial and the lawyer role without bringing every aspect of your authentic self to every moment. And it would not be healthy and it would not be helpful. So really having conversations about role clarity, about which sides of ourselves do we express, which sides of ourselves do we have to park and process later, what can we share amongst ourselves so that we can build a rich, sustainable professional identity, but that we don't share more broadly. So I think these are really, really important conversations, and I've been part of many conversations with judges and lawyers about that, and I find it fascinating.
Yeah. So the recommendations for systemic change are starting to emerge from this research. What would you say from your experiences and from your research are the most significant things that need to change?
I think the thing that most needs to change, but I think this is well on the way to having been changed, is, as I said before, thinking about lawyer and judicial wellbeing as a systemic issue, an issue that needs to be addressed at the level of the whole of the profession, because every part of the profession affects every other part. You've got law students, you've got solicitors, you've got barristers, you've got courts, you've got clients. We need to think of it as systemic. We need to understand where the sources of stress and challenge come from so that we can address them systemically, rather than seeing wellbeing as something that you just respond to as an individual. We're doing enough for our people if we provide them with an EAP service so that when they're stressed, they've got someone to talk to.
And some lunchtime yoga and,
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's not to say that stuff isn't valuable, but from an OH&S perspective, all of the data from other sectors is you change the work before you change the worker. And that's how you're going to get the biggest change and the biggest improvements. But I think we're well on the way to that. And in fact, the Legal Services Board and Commissioner, which is the Lawyer Regulation Authority in Victoria, has done fantastic work in recent years on thinking about lawyer wellbeing systemically. Firstly, getting systems data, but then developing, and I've been a part of some of this work as well, developing guidelines for legal workplaces around the systemic and organisational changes that should be implemented to give lawyers the best chance at staying well in the work, and then also piloting various interventions and evaluating them. So that's the first piece. This is much bigger than an individual issue, and it needs to be treated as such. I think where we see the greatest changes in a workplace is where this topic and the desire for reform and change has the unequivocal support from leaders at the highest echelons within the workplace. And when leaders get on board and make this a priority and acknowledge that they don't have all the answers and, are asking questions both of their workers but also of professionals, that's where we really see things improve most quickly. Also, I think what's really important is from time to time having champions speak honestly about their experience, and that has happened both among judicial officers and among lawyers, where senior and respected practitioners, judges have shared about a difficult time they've had and what got them through it. So that normalises the human in the work, and also gives hope that someone who's clearly successful has ridden out, difficult times, and that's okay. I think, what I would love as well is that just culturally we can move past the idea of seeing stress as a weakness. And I think there's many, many things that have to happen for that to really become a sort of permanent change in our culture. But it's so problematic because stress is just a natural human response to external demands. And there are many external demands in legal and judicial works. And over the course of a life, they're going to collide with personal challenges. So it's just inevitable that people are going to have difficult times. And when the stress is seen as a weakness, it gets in the way of people seeking help at an early opportunity. It compounds an already difficult time with isolation and shame. And it means that the system can't grow and people can't learn from and support each other. So that's a piece that's like a mindset shift. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with certainly the previous point that you said around, senior people talking about some of that stuff. I think that's really important because we're so entrenched with how we think we should behave and what we think is acceptable and what success looks like. And we were talking to another guest, and I think she sort of described that armor, when you've kind of got armor on and people can't see inside the armor. And I think that's very much what it is. Like, people just armor up. And then that just compounds because the new people that come into the profession and everyone around you see you being this, in inverted commas, superhuman, and think that that's how they have to act.
Yeah. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in an adversarial legal system, it's quite difficult to shift that because in order to do our best work for our clients, there's, I think it's fair enough to call it a need to project confidence in that environment, right? In the adversarial environment. And it just makes it difficult then for that not to generalize to every other environment within which we work. The courtroom environment, the adversarial environment is one part of it. But then that sort of becomes the professional persona and identity that we carry into all other aspects of our work and then all other aspects of our life sometimes.
Can I ask about individual therapy? Because the other thing, I just feel very strongly that we have these patterns embedded in us quite early on. And then I feel like once you get to this judicial level, that's compounded in many ways, So what you're probably seeing at an individual level for therapy with lawyers would be just, microcosm of then what you see at the high level. So
yeah, sure.
So you also provide individual therapy to people in the legal profession, so lawyers, presumably. What patterns do you see that brings them to your door? Are there lots of recurring themes that you often see?
Yeah, so I do provide individual therapy to lawyers and judges, actually, and not only in Australia, so overseas as well. And I think typically it's when the personal and the professional demands of life collide. So the work is always demanding, but when there's some significant challenge going on in the lawyer or judge's personal life, say divorce or an unwell child or caring for elderly parents, whatever it might be, when those two collide, that's often what brings people to individual therapy with me. Also, it can sometimes be when an earlier personal experience of trauma, because we have to remember it's not only, the trauma that people who end up becoming lawyers and judges encounter is not just vicarious trauma. Trauma is itself very, very common, and people have their own histories. Some experience of direct trauma, either from childhood or from earlier life, is triggered by a case on which they're working. That can sometimes be the impetus to seek therapy. Also, where the expectations of the role make it hard for them to discuss what they're going through with colleagues. That's kind of what we've spoken about before, that where the culture or just the understanding of what it means to be a professional means that people aren't speaking to others. So they want to have a confidential space. And also, very commonly, it's people come and they talk about the impact of toxic leadership and toxic workplace cultures. That's quite a common theme as well. But I will say that there are many positives. Working with lawyers and judges, there are many positive themes that I detect as well. So as clients, as psychology clients, lawyers and judges are, by definition, highly intelligent. That's a really great resource for therapy because it enables people to be encouraged into a meta view, a more analytical view of their own subjective experience, which is a really great lens to have. And they're also highly motivated to learn, to try and implement strategies that can make a difference. Usually very reflective, great with language, great at translating a difficult internal experience into language, which is one of the ways that we metabolize those experiences. So having that gift, that ability is a real strength, and well-resourced. You usually have quite a network of other people that they can be encouraged to bring into their experience. So I find it's one of the reasons why I love working with judges and lawyers is that it's really, really hopeful because the challenges can be real and the despair can be real, but there are so many wonderful personal resources that people bring to writing out that dark night of the soul. And I see it time and time again. So as a therapist, I come into a new encounter with all the hope that those past experiences have given me.
That is a very hopeful point to end on, isn't it? Right. That there are resources, there is a conversation happening around this now. And I understand that the findings, or some of the findings, will be published next year. Is that
That's the findings of the national study, yeah. The findings of my PhD are already published, but the national study, we're beavering away on those at the moment. So over the next 12 months, a series of books and articles will come out about that.
Yeah, and that's going to be such an important resource because apart from anything else, getting that information out there, but it's going to start the conversations that need to be had and some of those systemic changes. I'm sure that this important research will provide the impetus for some of those changes that need to take place.
Yeah, and in fact, the findings are directed towards identifying specifically the areas where we should target our attention systemically.
Yep. Fantastic.
Great. It's been so interesting to chat with you, Carly. Thank you so much. As I say, I could sit here for another few hours. I've got all sorts of thoughts running through my head, but we've really appreciated your time today.
It's been my real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, I loved that conversation. I feel like it's one of those conversations we could have broken it down into 3 or 4 parts and spoken for 45 minutes about each one. I'm excited to see the findings of the national study come out next year and read more about it. It's a very important project that has been going on, I know, for a long time.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I certainly learned a few things myself there, that idea of moral injury. I'd not heard that in that context before, and I can imagine that would be really relevant across all other professions. I can imagine doctors and, some other people that work in very broken systems.
Under-resourced and complicated systems, right? I liked what Carly talked about, particularly in relation to intentional hope. It's not naive optimism, but that's the key to surviving in these types of roles and these types of systems.
Yeah. I also liked how she said that it was important for senior and respected leaders in the professions to come out and talk about these kind of things. And I don't think either of you would suggest that either of us are senior and respected, but I think we're senior.
I agree.
But, certainly that's what we're trying to do with this podcast, I think, is have some of those conversations that maybe, people have not been having publicly in the past. So if we're playing a little role in that, that would be nice.
Yeah, for sure.
Outlaws, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please give us a like on social media or a follow, or drop us an email, contact@outlawspodcast.com.
For sure. And hopefully my face will have returned to full symmetry next week.
Yes. Have a great week, Kate.
You too. Thanks, Shayla. See you next week. Bye.